Welcome to episode 124, Supporting Asian American Clients in a Time of Crisis, Culturally Informed Care, featuring Dr. Helen Hsu, clinical psychologist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that I know is in many people's hearts and on many people's minds right now. I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Helen Hsu. She is a lead outreach clinician and liaison to the Asian American Activity Center, as well as a lecturer at Stanford University. She's also the past president of the Asian American Psychological Association. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Hsu.
Great. Glad to be here.
So why don't we talk a little bit first about you and your background and how you have this specialization in working with the AAPI, and for our listeners, that's the Asian American and Pacific Islander population.
Mm-hmm. I myself, I have a PsyD, and I knew I wanted to do clinical psychology. Coming out of a fairly research-oriented undergraduate program, I realized, that's not really where I want to be. I want to serve communities that are traditionally underserved. And I actually did not intend to specialize in BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous people of color, or Asian Americans. But the further I got my training, the more I realized a lot of clinical issues, family issues were not being addressed and people were being underserved. My family, myself, I'm an immigrant from Taiwan of Chinese heritage. So I really understood a lot of the intergenerational issues that clients were facing, that we were seeing, like people were saying that they had a hard time finding therapists who understood some of the cultural factors that were really important in therapy.
Absolutely. And as you and I were talking about releasing this interview, it's obviously a very emotional topic for Asian American and Pacific Islander individuals right now. So as we record this, we are currently at the very end of April, and there are so many hate crimes that have been committed against AAPI individuals. So, gosh, there's so much to cover. But in our talk today, what do you see as being, I guess, some of the basic and most fundamental foundational points that clinicians need to think about in supporting AAPI clients?
There's a lot to cover. I guess first is just even understanding the community. So maybe we'll have time to talk a bit about understanding the communities and then what are the current issues and how they've actually existed historically, but tend to flare up at certain times like now when we're in crisis.
Let's talk about the current flare. I think few people can speak better to it than you can. There's so much, I was driving to work today and written on the back of somebody's car was Stop Asian Hate. Right now, when there is so much active, quote unquote, Asian hate, where did this come from that there's been this new immersion of hatred toward AAPI?
There's a pretty clear body of research looking at just internet activity, which is fascinating, that showed how as the COVID-19 virus started to spread, especially during the time early on when people didn't know what was really happening, there was an origin believed to be in Wuhan in China, that suddenly there was an explosion of xenophobia, scapegoating, negative stereotyping, and blame. And so anecdotally, a lot of us in community service knew that this was going to be a big problem. So, for example, the Stanford Anti-Asian Harassment website is something we created last year, knowing that we were already hearing incidents were going up, people being harassed even on campus, in the community. And so the internet research had shown, too, that every time that slurs were used, racial slurs, that they spread like wildfire and were amplified across the internet. And so there's been a clear increase with that kind of blaming language to our current present day. And, it's actually not new in U.S. history. Actually, this concept of quote-unquote yellow peril, scapegoating, and blame existed in the 1800s. So there have been periods of time that this is not new racism, treating Asian Americans as a perpetual foreigner, even though we have like fourth and fifth generation Asian Americans, people who've never been to Asia in their life, who don't speak any other language, serve in the military, the PD. So I think the diversity of the group is something that gets confused and lost a lot too. The fact that AAPIs always feel judged by phenotype, so how they look, and that becomes an easy target for racism, as if they're somehow less American or a perpetual foreigner is a common microaggression experienced by Asian Americans.
One of the things you mentioned was a term yellow peril. Can you speak to that and explain what that is for our listeners?
Mm-hmm. Yellow peril was a sort of propaganda campaign in the 1800s that it was in reaction to a large influx of Chinese immigrant labor and tended to have stereotypes that were familiar to what people might hear now, that somehow these people were carrying disease or could never blend in or fit in. And it's always mixed up with a little bit of economic stuff too. So even in the 1800s, a lot of the resentment toward immigrants was as a labor force, as competition. And in the present day, some of the research on microaggressions toward Asian Americans has a strong component also of economic resentment or threat. So there is a theme through U.S. history.
Present day, here we are still very much in the midst of the pandemic. You and I could spend quite a bit of time, I'm sure, talking about some of the language that's been used politically that has contributed to the phenomenon that we're seeing right now. For many therapists, particularly those who are outside of the community and don't have a visceral awareness and understanding of what it's like from the inside out, we are talking about so many different cultures, so many different languages that are all squished into one acronym. Can you speak a little bit about the considerations and cultural differences within the AAPI community, knowing that that is a loaded question that asks for a lot of information in a short amount of time?
Yeah, I've got a lot of practice. So a really great place for, of course, every clinician to start is, how does your client self-identify? Because one way to think about Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, we're more like a coalition. We're not really an ethnic or racial or even cultural group. So the author Kathy Park Hong called it more a coalition, and I think that's the best description. She's the author of Minor Feelings, by the way, which is a fabulous contemporary book to get an understanding of really good, thoughtful essays on the Asian American experience. But we're talking about dozens of countries, dozens of languages, religions, so countries of origin. So as a clinician, I would say, trying to just, as you're doing your assessment, actually, how does your client self-identify? Are they an immigrant, like I am? And there's still a difference between an immigrant who came as a toddler, like me, and someone who came, say, as an adult or as an international student. They may not align themselves with the Asian American identity. Some people are like, no, I'm definitely Korean or Hmong American. I don't feel affiliation with the other groups. And then that's where they're at. I also don't always use NHPI, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, because they're actually also their own completely unique group. They're often with us, lumped with Asian Americans, and it's a great part of a coalition. But I also want to honor that Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, in other respects, are more like indigenous communities. So really wanting to honor that as well. Or there's also another acronym called APIDA, Asian Pacific Islander Desi Americans. And Desi really acknowledges South Asians. So kind of just getting a feel for where they're at, because you might look at somebody and just say, okay, they're Asian or they're Asian American, but actually there's all this depth at how they see themselves. Are they third generation? They could be fifth generation here. One of our fastest growing demographics is also like mixed heritage children and communities, and also transracial adoptees. So really getting a clear sense of wanting to understand and being extra careful not to make assumptions based on phenotype.
That phenomenon of phenotype, that's the source of so much discrimination that faces this community as a whole right now and in the past. Can you speak to that part of being assigned a certain identity because of the way you look?
It's a common thing that comes up in therapy that a perfectly well-intentioned therapist might just make an assumption. And so I've heard stories about clients saying like, well, I feel like, or, not just in therapy, but in places in my life, people act as if, based on my face, they think I don't speak English or something. And it's like, dude, I'm a third generation, like American, from Stockton or something. And so all the things that get attributed, and then how people get lumped together, and it has consequences, right? So for example, some of our smaller groups, so it's really important too that we're a super bimodal community. And what does that mean? That means if you look at the normal bell curve of, a population, we're the opposite. We're bimodal. We have the highest income communities way over the national norm, but we have the very, very lowest poverty-stricken communities too. We have communities that are AAPI with the absolute highest educational attainments and the absolute lowest in high dropout rates. Same thing for home language, English proficiency. We have communities with, again, high education, high advanced degrees, high English proficiency, and then we have super linguistically isolated communities that are really, really living in poverty, hard to access services. So we're so bimodal, and that causes a lot of confusion. So for example, in communities that are really struggling with more issues, perhaps because they came later or they came as refugees, they have more trauma, less resources, they often feel invisible when people assume, oh, you're Chinese. It's like, no, I'm not Chinese. I'm, from Bhutan, or I'm from Burma, or I'm Hmong. And so their needs may be missed. But on the other hand, we're also trying to figure out what are the needs, like with the model minority myth, which is really harmful. It's this idea that, oh, you're all rich, you're all smart, you're doing well. But that hides real needs in the community. And again, it blends us all together. A really sad case of, how this works is a hugely politically galvanizing event for Asian American communities was in I think it was 1982, was when Vincent Chin was murdered. He was a Chinese American man, and he was mistaken for Japanese by two laid-off auto workers who blamed Japan for losing their auto jobs. And they murdered Vincent. And so it's a good example of how we've come together as a coalition, realizing that in the U.S., we're often mistaken for the same anyway.
That phenomenon has carried over today in the attacks we've seen against individuals who were perceived to be AAPI, but were not, who were Hispanic or of other origin.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think some of the features about Asian American communities are most important for therapists to understand?
One is definitely those demographics, so not making... So being very thorough with assessment. Of course, we all would assess anyway, family of origin, what have you. But I think in keeping with the model minority myth and also how we've sort of been socialized, I think culturally and in the U.S., Asian Americans have a tendency to not speak up a lot about experiences, tend to try to focus on work as a way of gaining legitimacy or recognition or competency. And in fact, that's kind of where we're at some of our struggles now. What I've noticed too with a lot of Asian Americans who are now grappling with anxiety and anger and fear in this climate of hate is that many of us don't have a lot of experience articulating and talking about racism and microaggressions compared to, say, our Black colleagues and families and friends. It's less talked about. Culturally, there's often an issue of, handle things in your family. Don't talk about things that are difficult. Just focus on your work. So we're not even well equipped to articulate some of what we've experienced, except now you're seeing a huge explosion in people actually really expressing about and writing about and sharing, and an explosion of AAPI seeking therapy.
And prior to the pandemic, what were the rates of mental health service utilization among the AAPI community, and how has that changed in relation not only to the pandemic, but then also this wave of hate crimes?
I believe it's Mental Health America that had published an infographic a few years ago about how if the general population, about 18% of people were seeking therapy for AAPIs, it was something like, I think it was less than half, like 8%, and it wasn't because we have less needs. It was a combination of cultural stigma, not being able to find or access services was a big barrier. There's barriers about like financial, insurance, language, and then you add on top of that cultural competence and humility, that adds a lot of sort of barriers to the path.
One thing I saw recently on social media was a conversation between clinicians about paying extra attention about what specification somebody is looking for in a therapist, and how it came up was someone was seeking a therapist of East Asian descent.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a lot of confusion about what East Asian meant. Can you speak to why that difference is important for us to be keeping in mind when we're referring, so that people on the outside of the community are not committing those same assumptions and lumping everybody together?
Yeah, as clinicians, I think we always walk this fine line of we want to be very specific and careful in our assessment without trying to make somebody spend a whole bunch of time educating us. But I think there is a way to respectfully ask someone, I want to be really clear what you see as your most salient identities, because it might be that you are, say, Thai American, or it may be more salient to you, about the fact that you're a child of refugees and your income level, or it might be that you're queer, or live with a certain disability. So being really careful with that. And the reason someone might specify East Asian is that within AAPI communities, there is a growing awareness too of wanting, for example, East Asia generally refers to, say, China, Korea, Japan, the big ones in the Northeast Asia, right? And those cultures are really different than, say, Southeast, when we're talking about Vietnam or Laos, or if we're in India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka. They're geographically on different parts of the equator. They're culturally very different. And what about the Philippines? That's a huge community in the U.S., one of the largest AAPI communities. And there's also people speaking up that, for example, the 6 largest AAPI groups in the United States are Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Korean, and I believe Japanese. And so a lot of times people will talk about Asian Americans and they're talking about these groups, but that leaves out a lot of other people. So you may have someone who's like, I'm seeking an East Asian therapist because I want somebody who understands those family dynamics or cultural pieces. But for example, there's a movement called, they created a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag Brown Asians Exist, where a lot of Filipinos and South Asians are really speaking up about the fact that there's a lot of articles written or work done that talks about Asian Americans and leaves them out completely, even though they are 2 of the largest groups of Asian Americans in the United States.
I appreciate you breaking that down. Let's talk about when Asian Americans seek therapy. I'm curious, in your eyes, how has that changed more recently? I mean, I have seen on social media an explosion in request as a result of the vicarious trauma and the fear But before that, and how has it changed? What are the main concerns that generally the Asian American individual or family is going to be bringing into therapy?
So before the explosion in violence and harassment, we already were starting to see slightly more Asian Americans seeking treatment, which I see as a positive. There's definitely a generational difference. I think we're seeing that across the board, right? That young people are much more willing to talk about mental health, talk with each other on social media. So that is a positive. Although since the, I believe, late 70s, Stan Hsu had done a major research survey that looked at first contact with the mental health system. And for decades, it's held true that for most Asian Americans, their first contact was emergency. So they weren't coming sooner and doing more preventative work, which is, of course, what we would like to see. And so that's changing very, very slowly. Before this escalation in violence, we tended to see a lot of people dealing with intergenerational issues. That was huge. What do you do if you're raised by people who have had severe trauma, who may have had immigration stress, who have massive intergenerational issues, who may have a language barrier within the same home? You know, I've literally talked to people who are like, I can't even have a proper argument with my dad because my, Korean isn't good enough and his English isn't good enough. And we just both get so frustrated. So a lot of intergenerational issues and issues around immigration stress, trauma, microaggressions in the workplace, identity, those kind of things. And then now, in this past couple years, we're really seeing like skyrocketing anxiety, fears for safety, and what seems most painful is not even just fear for personal safety, but really feeling worried and protective for elders and for kids dealing with bullying and harassment. And the pain that brings up about wanting to protect the people you love, feeling unfairly blamed for things, used as a political scapegoat. And it's brought up identity issues, too, that people struggle with. There are many U.S.-born Asian Americans who've just never had to really question where they belonged in life, that are now finding themselves singled out in a way that maybe they haven't experienced that much before. Depending on where you live, APIs maybe experienced a lot of microaggressions or racism their whole lives, but others really didn't.
Can you speak to that a little bit and how that's been different for different populations, different states, different zip codes? I'm sure, there's a huge difference in that experience, but can you speak to that as a whole?
Imagine a young person who, say, goes to school in San Francisco or Fremont, California, right? If they're Asian American, they are used to the fact that there's plenty of other people and lots of different diversity in their school. And that if there's some things like cultural or family traditions that they have, that there will be somebody else who also shares that, right? They live in a city with huge cultural festivals, for example, and easy access to all kinds of like food or places of worship, where we've had people who've grown up where maybe they were the only Asian family in town or at their school, and they were always made to feel that something was wrong with the way they ate or how their parents looked or that they spoke another language, and actually were really raised with a sense of feeling somehow less than. And so there's a whole other factor that might come into therapy of internalized racism. We see that with internalized sexism, internalized homophobia, how people have felt their whole lives to be made ashamed of who they are. And so there's a lot of reclaiming like a healthy sense of self if you've maybe never seen models of that, and also getting very negative messages. There's also what my friend E.J. Ramos has written about colonial mentality, that some of this is intergenerational, right? Like some of my students have internalized racism from going to an all-white school and always feeling like the one left out all through, say, high school or whatever formative years. some of her family suffer colonial mentality, which EJ talked about. When you come from a culture that maybe has been colonized, oppressed for generations, are you raised with the very ideas that somehow, oh, being darker is terrible, or, Western beauty ideals or education is somehow better? And so those are topics that people really do explore in the therapy room as well.
There's so much here that we can talk about. One of the other considerations that I think is very real, particularly for Asian women, is the sexualization of Asian women. Can you speak to that consideration and what clinicians need to keep in mind when working with a female identifying AAPI person?
Hopefully, you've all been reading quite a bit about Asian women raising their voices following the Atlanta, horrific murders that specifically targeted 3 Asian businesses. And I think that plays into a lot of what a lot of us have experienced our whole lives in the United States and there's 2 sides of this coin: the explicit sexualization of Asian women and girls, and the explicit demasculinization of Asian men and boys, right? So this is a systemic issue, and it's quite complicated. But if you think of it this way, so many of the images we see in popular media, right, we always tend to depict the Asian man as the tech guy or kind of nerdy. That is slowly changing, I think, in popular media. A lot of powerful media has always depicted the very few times that you might see Asian women in movies or whatever, they were often war movies. And so there's a very complicated history about U.S. imperialism and colonialism in other countries that often encounters with Asian women in those kind of terrible wartime conditions. People, for example, may have been sex workers to survive, and it didn't represent actual Asian women at all, except for in this one very narrow slice of history. But it spread into this dehumanizing fetish that if you talk to Asian women and girls, they'll often say they've experienced all their lives. So, and again, the confusion of who you are. So I've certainly been in the street and had people screaming konnichiwa at me. And it's since I was a child, and I was like, what? And it's oh, they think you're Japanese, or they're trying to hit on you because they have some weird Asian fetish, So we talk about yellow fever as being this gross fetishization. Even in the queer community, people have talked about rice queens, right? And so it's the ways that we have a fetish that isn't about, oh, I'm really attracted and want to know this person. It's, I have these stereotypes and images that really obliterates the individual humanity of a person. And that there are systemic ways that are rooted in imperialistic history about why we've done that to certain cultures and to certain genders. So it's a very painful experience for a lot of Asian women. If you imagine the normal sexual harassment that women face anyway, going about their daily lives, but adding that really ugly piece of, if you talk with clients who will say just normal things I'm just trying to enjoy a party at school, or going to get my groceries, and then somebody's coming up and throwing all these disgusting fetishes at me or following me.
That must have been awful for you as a kid. I mean, always, but I'm curious, how do, through your lens, professionally and personally speaking, how do elders in the Asian American community tend to address those initial examples of discrimination toward kids like you talked about?
I think our probably most suffering community now are the sandwich generation, because they're worried about both their elders and their kids. And it can be different. Our elders have tended to handle things with a certain stoicism. There tends to be a collectivist bent and a multi-generational family type situation with many Asian American families, but there tends to be stoicism, or we try not to talk too much about problematic things. We don't want to worry each other. But right now in this climate, it's almost impossible. I do some corporate consulting. I've talked to a lot of Asian staff at different places, and it's hard for them. Like, I make all this money. I've done all the right things, followed all the rules, sort of attained all the like normal respectability. And yet here I am telling my elderly parents they can't go for a walk, or they can't go to the grocery store because I'm worried about them. Or here's my kid saying he's coming home from school and people said slurs at him and he didn't know what they meant. And having to explain like this really ugly stuff. Was it Andy Kim? It was actually a state representative, a government who talked about how hard it was to have his little boy come home and and say kids at school were calling him slurs or, related to China virus or something. And his son was so little, he was honestly confused. He's like, I'm a New Jersey boy, and couldn't understand. To do with me. Yeah, he didn't know why they were saying these things, like because he's not Chinese, he's Korean American, and he's from New Jersey. But how hard and painful it is to navigate that for yourself, and then also for your elders and for your kids.
For many marginalized communities, the habit had been to keep a stiff upper lip. To not talk about it, to acknowledge it happened, but otherwise move on. Typically, Asian Americans pursue therapy at a rate much lower than their white counterparts. Is part of that phenomenon, that stoicism of we don't talk about the bad thing and we just kind of accept as it is and move on.
There's a lot of good reasons. One is that, yes, there's a tendency that that's how we cope. You sort of just work hard, put your head down. Of course, what we're seeing now with this increase in harassment is like, that doesn't work, right? Just trying to color in the lines isn't going to protect you. One factor, too, to think about is, especially if your client is an immigrant, really making sure that they understand limits of confidentiality, but how strong confidentiality is. So, for example, I've worked with some immigrants that came from China that the laws are not the same for therapy there. And so they actually really liked the fact that here I would be fined thousands of dollars, and be in serious violation if so they really trusted that the confidential laws here were different. So some people come from countries of origin that don't have the same kind of laws or licensure boards. So that's also a fear, right? When people find out. So really, as therapists, really soothing those fears, like, hey, explaining this is how it works here very carefully. There's a tendency to feel that things should be solved within a family. So I think for most communal cultures, there's that tendency. And hence, often by the time an AAPI family comes to therapy, it's already been going on for some time. Or they might come because an authority recommended it, like a teacher. Or it may be an MD referral. And then the final issue is, of course, access and then finding the right therapist. So access, you could do a whole thing about just insurance issues and transportation and language. So that's a big thing. But assuming all those things are taken care of, I live in Silicon Valley, a lot of APIs do have insurance, but then it becomes a question of, is this therapist going to be helpful to me? And what's even more alarming that I hear stories about is sometimes a therapist can actually cause more harm, even if well-intentioned, through their own stereotyping or lack of skill. So there's a lot of social media posts, and I've even put out a video on YouTube explaining to a potential client, here's questions or things you might ask a therapist if you want to ascertain if they sort of have the culturally affirming skills. And I'll be the first to say, therapist ethnic or culture match or gender match is not required. It's not. There aren't enough of us anyway, so it's impossible, but it's also not required. However, that would require a therapist to do a lot of careful practice of cultural humility, right? That constant growth mindset of like, okay, am I understanding this correctly? clarifying things, being respectful, thinking outside my own worldview, doing a little research as needed. So for example, we're trying to train clients now, like, you can ask a therapist, what kind of training have you ever had? Maybe with anyone in my group. And the real answer to that question for most of us is almost none. If you really think about what we learned when we got licensed, there was maybe one multicultural class, we've read very little about how to actually be effective therapists with AAPIs. Gordon Nagiyama Hall, also a former Asian American Psych Association president, has talked very openly about his career in research and the fact that I think it was like 2011, but basically there was like a 10 or 20 year span that the National Institute of Health funded for AAPI health projects 0.17% of the funding. 0.17. Now, we are about 6% of the US population. So you think about that funding and then you realize, yeah, I really haven't had much training. I haven't read much, So Nagiyama et al., they have a study about like culturally adapted therapy practices and how, again, there's very few. So it is something that we can all stand to learn. I mean, my own cultural humility practice is, each year I reflect a little on like, what are my growth edges for this year and my goals? And so in the past, for example, there have been times, even me as a person of East Asian descent, I really went and had to do a lot of reading and learn more about Southeast Asian communities or people who have intergenerational refugee trauma. That was a growth edge for me. Or this year, it's really learning more about ableism and how that affects people's lives. So I think as therapists, figuring out what can we do to like fill these gaps so that a person doesn't feel like they're going to come in and actually get invalidated or microaggressed against by their own therapist.
Can you talk about that piece, about the microaggressions that could be happening even as we speak in the therapy room, so that clinicians hear, like, I guess the short list of, hey, what not to do?
Yeah, it's true. There are times I've given trainings where I've actually gone on Reddit and taken some quotes from people about their bad experiences in therapy. And it's like, it's hard to hear as a therapist, but it's like, yeah, we got to learn, right? Yeah, it's things like, well, and it's not also even just white therapists.
Absolutely. I think, and I'm glad you make that distinction. And I think that's a consideration as well, this awareness that even when we have our own marginalized identity card in our wallet or multiple cards, that doesn't mean we know or understand what somebody else's card is and their experience of having that card in their wallet.
Yeah. So what comes to mind is, the what not to do. There was a Filipina client whose East Asian therapist was like, colorism. I don't think that's real. My family doesn't do that. Whereas for the Filipina client, colorism was a huge, constantly shaming, hurtful thing that happened all the time, Or there was a client who said, upon meeting them, it seemed like the white therapist was trying really hard to maybe bond, but did it in a way that felt microaggressive. Like the white therapist talked about like how they had traveled to Japan or how their friend had adopted an Asian baby. And it just felt like, you're projecting these things onto me and I'm not Japanese and I'm not adopted, The number one complaint I actually hear from Asian American clients that they've experienced in therapy is actually about being told that their family boundaries are not individuated enough, are too enmeshed. And that is a very individualistic Western view. Now, I work with plenty of my clients on boundary issues because I do think interpersonal boundaries are important for health. But it is not my place to impose my own personal preference for what exactly and where exactly those boundaries have to be set. And so that is the top thing I hear is individualistic Western therapists who don't comprehend intergenerational or codependent or collectivist boundaries telling clients like these values are not as good or they're not healthy or oversimplifying like you just need to do you and don't care what anybody thinks when that may not be their cultural value.
For our listeners who are not as familiar with the individualistic versus a collectivistic cultural norm, can you speak to that and how that might appear in therapy when working with an AAPI individual or family?
Maybe it's a level of nuance, right? Like I had a client who her biggest issue was that she had a very serious falling out with her in-laws. I mean, this happens to everybody across cultures, but she had a very serious falling out with her in-laws. However, it was extremely valuable to her as a person, Chinese Singaporean descent, to have close family intergenerational ties. That was a huge value. And so she really struggled because she definitely still wanted her children to have a positive relationship with their grandparents. And her white therapist just said, well, this is very simple. You just do you. And she was like, well, but this is really important for the kids to have this bond, you know, it's very valuable. Like my grandparents were a huge part of my life. And the therapist was like, no, you just need to stop. Like you do what's comfortable for you. Don't care about anybody else. And everyone else just has to accommodate that, you know, and it was really like completely negating, not even engaging in discussion about, is there room for compromise? You know, what would it mean? You know, what is the meaning of your kids not being as close to their grandparents or, you know, just like a more nuanced explanation. It was very like you, the individual, are more important than anything else. And that's just not how a lot of people in this world function. And as I often point out when I do teach white therapist audiences, you know, collectivist cultures are the global majority. That is the global norm. So it's actually those of us educated in a Western individualistic industrialized norm that are like not quite getting it, you know, and that I do think there has to be a way of helping people figure out how do they moderate the intergenerational gap. Like, yes, you absolutely should not probably do the same norms as your grandparents or parents did. You're in a different culture now and times have changed. However, where that compromise takes place for each person is a very individual choice that they have to figure out what suits them and their family, rather than just saying this is just the one way, you and your family just need to do it the, you know, Western therapy model way. Like, yeah, that's not really going to work.
That said, knowing that, my goodness, as I'm thinking about it, so many different models that we use in the United States are so big on like boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
and are so different for many quote unquote Western therapists that have had this individualism. I guess they've really been marinated in it.
Mm-hmm.
How do they need to frame and approach therapy differently when working with individuals from collectivistic cultures?
It's really clarifying, right? And your client may not have articulated this, just as we have values that we may not have necessarily sat down and like written out and articulated. The client may not know, but maybe spending some time doing that, right? Like there's like those values worksheets and checklists in many CBT type workbooks or whatever. We actually use those often. Just taking some time to clarify, especially because if you have bicultural people, we have third culture people, you know, it gets confusing. Like, yeah, I don't know, where are you in your values and experience? Let's actually take some time and identify that. You know, there was a fascinating study years ago, even just, it was a small one, but even just among Asian Americans at UC Berkeley. Right, we like to use our students as research subjects, but that they had found even a difference between US-born Asian American students and those that had immigrated, even if they immigrated early. And it was something like it boiled down to, if you ask the American-born ones, what's the meaning of life, they generally tended to respond much more similarly to individualistic Western people, it was like, oh, the pursuit of happiness, Whereas immigrants tended to say something like, to do something worthwhile, to be of value, to make my family proud, And that's a small but important core way of identifying yourself.
Sitting with that idea, particularly right now, and I'm imagining myself as a white therapist sitting with a person or a family who's Asian American, how do we best make space to feel and talk through the gravity of what's happened to the community in the last few years?
I think the ability to sort of validate and sit with a lot of ugliness, it's difficult for everybody, and even for therapists, right? I think sometimes there's a defensiveness that can kick in, and that's a whole other Robin DiAngelo white fragility discussion, but really just trying, as therapists can do well, to try and sit with and listen, what is the experience, without jumping in, because I've heard clients say things like, my own psychiatrist said I was overthinking, and basically invalidated that this hate crime had happened to me, or showed a real lack of understanding, like, oh, but you're Asian, it's not like you face things like Black people do. Like, in the grand scheme of things, of course, we do not face the same stressors as Black communities. However, that doesn't mean that someone's not sitting with something extraordinarily painful or dangerous feeling. And there is a powerful role. Sometimes, when I said culture match is not required, sometimes people in small communities explicitly want a therapist that's not in their community. I've worked with very small communities like Afghani and Cambodian. They're very small communities. They sometimes really do want a therapist who's not affiliated. And then sometimes it can be very powerful to have a white therapist validate something that they feel invalidated for. Like, I'll always remember a young client who struggled a lot with feeling like his parents, he had a lot of, I think, internalized shame, internalized racism. He felt embarrassed his parents didn't speak English well. He felt resentful that they weren't as affectionate as his white friends' parents, And for him, it was really powerful to have a white therapist say, it seems like your parents do all these other things to show love. Like, what do you think it means when they send you food packages and pay your tuition and keep asking about how you slept? Or, so it can actually be very validating to have a white clinician actually acknowledge things like, okay, your family does things differently, but it's still valuable and just as good. Or like, yeah, I do see how this is horribly unjust, what's happening in this community. And you're right. We should talk about, how you're coping and what your rage is about, or what are the resources we can bring as you learn about how to protect your kids against bullying, or maybe that you want to take a more active role in social justice because it helps you feel empowered at a time that things feel really hateful. But yeah, validation is huge, right? Not buying into like the very limited range of what we know. And I think sitting with cultural humility and growth, it's difficult sometimes, but it's hugely important. And even within the Asian American community, I'm the majority dominant, right? I'm an East Asian person. I've had to really sit with like, okay, I need to learn more about the path of Tongan Americans in this country, or people from Laos. I didn't even know about Hmong people until I started working in Asian community mental health services in Oakland. So we all have growth areas, and being really, really open about that. And that includes just trying our best to set a therapeutic space where the client can feel okay to give feedback. And it might not always be verbal feedback, because not every culture is comfortable face-to-face verbally confronting someone who may be an authority figure.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking about what you had said about a referral from a teacher or from an MD, and that idea as well with authority. I've had the experience I do not have a doctorate, but I have had the experience, particularly working with the AAPI community, being given the title doctor and saying, nope, just a therapist, master's level. But I think it draws attention to that phenomenon and the awareness of power differential in the room. And that's also kind of part of the culture as well.
Yeah, that hierarchy is a really big deal, and it's really ancient. But we can really play a role in being like, for example, some Asian clients there was an Asian international student at Columbia, I think, who'd made a video about how she never said anything when she was unhappy with her therapist, but she would fill out the evaluation, and so are there ways they can give us feedback or how we respond to it, right? I've had clients say no, actually, my family does this, and just being open to being I apologize, I was mistaken or I made an assumption, right? And hopefully really demonstrating that there's space for that in this relationship.
I'm glad you bring up that piece and the importance of clinicians making space. And for any of our listeners, we have so many continuing ed courses that are talking about things like implicit racial bias, when therapist-client values clash, when we've created a cultural offense, things like that. So I encourage you to listen to those. One of the pieces that's coming up for me as we're talking about this, Dr. Helen, this community right now is reasonably scared. And I could also hear the potential for someone of Asian American descent coming in and saying, well, how do I keep myself safe? And almost the therapy shifting to more of a case management in talking about practical resources and services. What are some of the things that you'd like clinicians to keep in mind if they're faced with that question of how do I keep myself safe? What do I do? When do I go to the market? How, what if it's after dark? All of these considerations that are very real.
I think it is a good time for all clinicians to read up on resources and practicalities. It will, of course, vary depending on where you live. Although one of the sad things about this particular way of anti-Asian harassment, people have tended to feel they were safer in places with lots of other diverse communities, but that hasn't been true. So the Stop AAPI Hate website is a really great resource for clinicians who may feel I don't know a lot about this. Stop AAPI Hate is a site that allows people to record and track incidents, but it also has data. So you can also learn more about things. There's also a great youth buy-in for youth report at the Stop AAPI Hate site. So that's really worth reading as well, especially if you work with young people. There's things like bystander intervention training, right? That's a great thing for any community member to take and refer people to. And really thinking about, Dr. Bettina Love talks about being an accomplice, a collaborator, more than just an ally. And I really love that, right? So an ally is yeah, I think this is bad. Maybe I'm posting things. Maybe I'm, talking to a few people. But stepping it up to a level of being an accomplice, a collaborator, implies having to put some real skin in the game, some work, or some risk. And that's something for each therapist to think about as so many communities are under attack. So about 4 years ago, for example, the Asian American Psych Association took a stand to, for example, support Black Lives Matter, to go to their rally, to fundraise, to speak up, even when we got some very negative pushback, right? But it's ultimately, how do we as therapists live with our values and support communities as we're trying to teach clients to live within their values and be empowered?
Thank you for sharing that idea about the difference between an ally and an accomplice, and that allyship sometimes can just basically be a bumper sticker, and that it's much more than that. And I appreciate that framing and the importance of actually, as therapists and for many clinicians, viewing ourselves as inherently part of the social justice process, to think about our involvement and have it be greater than a bumper sticker, have it be greater than just making space in the therapy room, but to actually be very deliberate in our creation of being an accomplice. I appreciate that, that framing. For clinicians who are listening You've already listed some great resources. The Stop AAPI Hate. There, as Dr. Helen had mentioned, there's some really good resources out there for bystander intervention, and really well done PDFs and infographics that are helpful to view of, if you're around these things when they're happening. What are other trainings that you would want other clinicians to go to that personally are really good?
There's more and more available. I mean, that's maybe our only good thing, right, out of pandemic, remote options, or even the Asian American Psychology Association has a conference every year. It's going to be remote this year, like last year. We are setting up slowly a YouTube site to deal with remote life. There's an Asian American Journal of Psychology, which has, I think, our most popular issue is the one around like this phenomena of tiger parenting, but there's special issues on suicide, on all these different topics. And really just seeking out for yourself. Like I have a friend who's teaching a class for master's level therapist, and she's looking for new text on multicultural counseling. And really what we're finding is that these days, a lot of people are saying that the general multicultural cultural competence models are not quite sufficient. That it's really about we're constantly learning. Like, even I am never going to be culturally just competent, period. It's not like you are or you aren't. It's like this gradient of like, I can always be keeping and getting better and learning. The same way that I'm having to learn about how do I serve like Gen Z, and the iGen, we can all learn to do better about how we're serving certain cultural communities and stay in tune with that. So pay attention to what your own professional orgs might offer. I just did a big training for the California Marriage Family Therapy Association. I think there are more and more specific trainings. And then also looking at intersectional trainings, right? It's different for, say, people who are asylum seekers. It's different for people who may be queer or disabled. That it isn't a coincidence that sometimes the more aware of something I become, suddenly it seems like more of my clients have these issues. And is it just because now I'm doing better at like making space for, chronic illness as well as your cultural identity, for example? So thinking about that, I do have a YouTube channel that is also fledgling that was only revived because of pandemic. And there's also just an anti-harassment. There's more and more anti-harassment, like resource guides out, but there is one at Stanford I could send the link to that just gives a little bit of history and then resource. And the resource list just keeps growing, unfortunately, with the times that we're in.
Thank you so much, Doctor. For people who want to do some reading or listen to audiobooks, are there any particular books that you find particularly helpful and notable for opening our perspective and awareness of working with the AAPI community?
You'll always hear Gerald Wing Sue, and he does have a new one out now that I think is really helpful that actually talks about micro-interventions, right? And so he's done a huge body of work, as have many others, about microaggressions, or why even talking about racism is so difficult. But I think this newest one on micro-interventions is a really good guide to just how even small things that we can do in everyday life, or maybe small things in session, can be a force against racism and microaggressions in these little ways. And what they actually sound like, for example. So I think that's a really great place to start. And then for specific communities, there are books like Kevin Nadal's books about Filipino-American psychology in particular. And then I'd mentioned Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, which is not a therapy book, but is really a powerful book about contemporary Asian American experiences.
Thank you. I think these are very helpful resources. Again, for our listeners, we have Dr. Helen Hsu here. And Dr. Helen, for people who want to get in touch with you or learn more about the breadth of the work that you do, please share that information with us.
I'd be happy to see you. Well, I am on YouTube, just under Helen H. Hsu, and as well as on Twitter. And on Instagram, I'm actually Hella Mental Health. If you're from Northern California, you know what hell is about.
I'm from NorCal. I get the hella.
Yeah. Yes.
And how about, are there any other articles or resources, any trainings you personally have coming up or are involved in? You mentioned the YouTube channel. You have some there.
Other than that, basically, if you also follow the Asian American Psychological Association, which does have a Facebook page, and as I said, building a YouTube page, AAPA is a great source nationwide for a whole wide variety of Asian American mental health issues. And we have divisions within us focusing on topics such as women, multiple heritage Asians, LGBTQ, South Asians, a division on practice, Filipino Americans. So APA is actually probably like a great hub. And there's also a group called Asian Mental Health Collective, and they have a Facebook page as well.
Wonderful. This has been so helpful, and thank you for taking this time out, particularly at a time like this, to help the clinical community be more of service to the AAPI community. I really appreciate it.
Great. I'm glad to be here. We need our therapists very badly. I believe in therapy and that it does a huge service. And yes, I'd like to see more and more Asian Americans actually find, confident, affirming counselors.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Helen. You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.